Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Bat Cave. It is Friday, and it is, August 8th, 2025, and I am kind of stuck on the chronologies of Egypt and trying to put together a basic understanding of how it could align with the Bible in terms of chronologies. And I want to just take this time to verbally process this. Maybe you guys have some thoughts and ideas that you can share. Maybe you guys might have done some research that is relevant to this. But I want to show you some huge circular reasoning problems with the Egyptian chronologies that just doesn't work historically. And we know they don't work, and there's evidence that there's a bunch of different kings lists that essentially are being composed to be sequential when they're in fact a bunch of parallel kings lists. Several of them that seem to end around the time Joseph and the Egyptians take over. But more importantly than that, we are basically the evidence that we have based on the known kings lists is that they may have some evidence on this thing called the Palermo stone, which reflects the kings before the flood. But I don't think it does, and I'm going to show you why. Because Canaan's name seems to be in it, in a theophoric name, which basically means he's being worshipped as a god already. And there is a Canaan in the pre-flood world. Because there is a Canaan, the son of, Kenan, the son of Enosh. So there's a possibility that the god Canaan in Egypt is based on this Canaan versus the Canaan from the son of Ham, but I doubt it. And the reason is because there doesn't seem to be evidence in the god names of Egypt of any other gods being worshipped before the flood. That was basically Ra, which is based on Utu, Horus, which is based on Enoch, Isis and Osiris, which is based on Inanna and Dumuzid, or Abel and his widow, and then this guy Mantu, who seems to have been a Nephilim warlord before then. There are other gods, but those gods seem to be based on a merger of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And what they're doing is essentially they're merging the God, the Word of God, and the Spirit of God with the creation of Adam and Eve by Yahweh, which would basically make him the sun god Ra, and them being Shu and Geb. And it just seems to merge the attributes of the Holy Spirit and the Word, or the earth and the sky, the creation order of the earth and the sky, with Geb and Shu, and merge Elohim, then the creator, with Ra, or which is based on Yahweh. So they just don't have a lot of gods, and very few gods are in their theophoric names. But you are going to find Canaan, one of the first ones to emerge after Ra, and then Mantu, which seems to be this guy who Menez and Min seem to be based on him. And this Menez gets put at the beginning of their pantheon, at the beginning of their kings list, on top of this guy named Narmer. So that seems to be a revision, and they do that probably around the generations after the Jews. So just as your baseline, I want you guys to understand where we're getting this information from. So the lists that we have that ultimately make it into Manetho's kings list, which is going to be in the Library of Alexandria 10 years before the LXX is written, seems to be just a bunch of BS. And I want to show you what it's based on. So, again, you have this Palermo stone, which they say is based on, is 2498 to 2345. That's what they say this is dated. However, they don't have any reason to date it at this time. Here's the thing with this Egyptian archaeology stuff. This stuff has gotten ripped off by rich families basically throughout Europe and stuff like this, and it's called the Palermo stone because it's in Palermo, Italy. So nobody was like, oh, we dug through the dirt and then we did carbon dating, because this thing was ripped off and taken to Italy in the 1800s before they invented carbon dating. So we have no way to take a rock and figure out how old the rock is. What they do is they say, oh, these kings in here are dated to these dates based on the Turin's Kings list and Manetho's Kings list. Well, the Turin's Kings list doesn't date them. Manetho dates them, and Manetho is in the 3rd century BCE. Okay. Well, we know based on analysis of stuff that's in the Turin's Kings list and the lists that were around it that they were taking dynasties that we know now to be parallel with each other and making them on top of each other, similar to what the Sumerians Kings list did. Okay, well, they learned from the Sumerians Kings list because we know for certain that the Egyptians had Byblos and Carchemish way back in the days of what is it called? Zimri Lim of Mari, which was basically the guy who was in charge of the Amorites that were all over Syria and Babylonia. He was kind of like the chief of that confederacy before Hammurabi takes it all over and starts the Babylonian Empire. Okay, it's him who he overthrows. So before the Babylonian Empire, we know that the Egyptians are trading with the Babylonians. We know they have trade relationships with them. And this governor of Byblos actually tells you which pharaoh is ruling when Zimri Lim is ruling. So we know that there's a certain thing that we can align around 1800 BCE, which is based on the Masoretic around 500 years after the flood, connecting the Amorites of Babylon or Babylon and Syria with the Egyptians. So we know this. We know they're trading together. Because we have that, we can trust this dating of 1800. Okay, but when we take that and we measure that up against the stuff that comes afterwards, we find that okay, this doesn't work. You have to compress some stuff together, and then we find other stuff in Egypt that we've dug up since this that proves that some of these dynasties were parallel to each other and competing. But the earliest kings list we have from Egypt, remember this Palermo stone is just a rock that somebody dug up. So it's estimated by some people to be written in the 8th or 7th century BC. The only reason we could say that it came from, again, it says it contains a list of the kings from the 1st dynasty through the 5th dynasty, which means it has to have been written after the 5th dynasty, which would be 2400 BCE, if we're assuming this was written by them and not somebody later. Okay? Well, we know that from Solon, which is, or it's going to be in Plato's Timaeus, that Solon, which is the Greek basically statesman, philosopher who was responsible for leaving the vacuum of power in Athens that turned into the first Greek democracy in the 6th century, that he went to Egypt and he was in Sais around the time that Pharaoh Necho and his heirs were ruling Egypt. So this would be prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, but not long prior. It's actually within like a generation of that. And he is getting taught by the Egyptians that their history is more certain than the Greeks' history, and they're trying to convince them not to believe in the global flood because their history was written on stone. And so they know that their pre-flood history because it was written on stone. Okay? Now, this is not that stone, but is an example of the kind of thing that the Egyptians had, and we know the Egyptians were historical liars. We know they would erase people, they would add people, they would change people with other people, and their whole thing was to prove that they were the oldest civilization in the world. But what they're telling the Greeks this is in the 7th century BC, is that the Greeks are actually much older than the Egyptians, but they never kept records in stone like the Egyptians are, and that's why they don't remember that there's been many floods, and once upon a time Athens and Egypt got together and defeated Atlantis across the sea, and they start telling the Atlantis myth, and Plato counts the Atlantis myth on in another one of his books as well. Okay? Well, all this is BS. Okay, the Egyptians make stuff up. They lie. I mean, you got to remember, these are the priests who use magic tricks on their own pharaohs to deceive them. Okay, this is a long, long history of a priesthood that is convincing people to pay them tons of money to bury them in a special way that will make sure they have all their arms and legs and be able to breathe and be able to see and all this stuff in the afterlife. This is a cult that is based around making a lot of money by making people feel like they need them to do all these magic rituals before they die. So these are not honest people, okay? Beyond that, we know that all of their kings lists start in the same Pharaoh who got his butt kicked by Yahweh in the Exodus. So Amhos II. So when we go to these kings lists, the oldest one that we know of its date, because of where it is and what's associated around it, is the Karnak's kings list. And that was created in 1450 BC. That's their estimate, okay? Well, the Karnak kings list, the dating of the Exodus is 1446 BC. So when they say around 1446 BC, this is probably propaganda that was written after the fall of Egypt to Yahweh, basically. Okay, the decimation of Egypt. And what we know about it is that I believe the Hyksos are removed from it. So the Karnak Kings list, which is composed, it looks like right after the Jews leave, excludes the Hyksos, which are going to be in the Turin's Kings list and Manetho's Kings list. So we know they're there. Not only are they there, they're there and they match up perfectly with the Hebrews in terms of a timeline. It excludes them, but it also excludes female rulers and a bunch of kings that are unpopular. Okay, so we know that there's all kinds of. It says the Karnak Kings list was compiled by the Theban kings who later expelled the Hyksos. Okay, what does this mean? This is the dynasty that enslaved the Hebrews and then watched the Hebrews walk in them after Egypt gets decimated. Okay, that is the oldest kings list. So when you hear about this stuff, and we know. You got to remember, when people first started researching this stuff, the Jews were reporting that the Exodus happened in the 13th century instead of the 15th century. And the reason they're doing this is because they're aligning the idea that the Jews built, it says they built the cities of Pithon and Ramses. Well, before scholars figured out that the Jews updated city names, we have Joseph. Notice it says, "In the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh has commanded." This is what is written. Okay, and so they're assuming that Moses has to be after Ramses. That's the only thing that can work. Well, Ramses the first is not till the 12th century or the 13th century. So if we look at Ramses the first, we see 1292 to 1290, and so what they do is they put the Exodus in the days of Ramses II, which is 1279 to 1213, and all of the Jewish dating on when the Exodus happened has been from this time, from at least the Middle Ages. We don't know exactly when they started. Okay, but what we know now is that what we should have known this from internal biblical evidence. They also have in Moses Dan being named Dan, when the story of how it becomes named Dan is in Joshua and Judges in two different places, showing that it happened after they entered in the Promised Land. So if this happens after Moses is dead, how is it in Moses' writings called Dan in Genesis? Well, because the Jews updated place names. And when did they update place names? Well, this is just my guess. But my guess is when they transferred from Proto-Hebrew into Aramaic, they updated the place names based on what they were called at that time. So this would probably be around the 5th or 6th century, which is why you have these conjectures and theories in the scholarly world that the books of Moses were just written for the first time in the days of Hezekiah. That's what they believe. Well, why did they believe that? Well, because those place names would have had their dates in the days of Hezekiah. That's why they believe that. Well, the Jews aren't stupid. They're not going to... None of these priesthoods are stupid. I mean, if they're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, they know that places change names. If they're trying to deceive you, they're not going to be so dumb as to be like, oh, that city was called Dan, and then write the story of how it gets the name Dan hundreds of years later. They're not going to do that. So when we look at things named Ramses, we go, okay, well, what is Ramses? Well, we know now that Ramses is Avaris. There's people who've done scholarly study on this, and they go, the store city of Ramses that they talk about, the cities of Ramses and Pithon, Notice it says the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses and Succoth was a later name given in the days of Ramses II to Avaris. Avaris becomes basically a treasure city of theirs, okay? Well, before it was a treasure city, it was the capital of the Israelites in Goshen. And so when they say they built the trade cities of Pithon and Ramesses, it says, therefore did they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithon and Ramses. These are the cities that they built, but they weren't called that. Notice it says Raamses. It's spelled differently there. They weren't called that until after Ramses renamed them that, okay? And it turns out that Pithom and Ramses is some other city in Avaris, okay? So if you watch the guys on Pattern of Evidence, they explain how they know this, okay? So the point is, we know that the Hebrews update place names after the fact, and there is this really obvious place which would be a good time to update place names, which is when you're changing scripts. If you're literally writing a new Hebrew, or a new Hebrew manuscript that is based on this Aramaic script, and a lot of the people that this is going to are going to be Jews that live in Egypt, wouldn't you want to have the Egyptian cities named based on names they understand? And of course, the cities of the ancient Near East, everything around Babylon is still pretty close to the time they're doing this. Everything around the land of Judea is still pretty close to doing this. But we have these various cities that it talks about their name changes that we know of, and then we see the names of these place names just in Genesis named after their more modern place name. So we have examples of this in the Bible where it was like Hebron was called Hebron, then it was called Kiriath Arba, then they change it back to Hebron again, and so they just make it Hebron. And maybe it was originally Hebron, or maybe they called it Hebron after the fact, but we just have it called Hebron in Genesis, and then we also have Dan called Dan, okay? So if we know this, we know they changed place names, we go back and then we go, well, where does this stuff align to? And we figured out based on the, they call it the Stele of Shishak, when Shishak goes and sacks, or doesn't sack Jerusalem, but basically sacks a bunch of cities in Judah and then gets paid off by Solomon's son to go back to Egypt and leave him alone. They become tributaries to him for a generation. We know when that happened because he set up a stele that records his victory and the cities that he sacked and stuff like this. And so it's based on that we can match up the date of Solomon and his son's reign, and then go back to when it says 480 years before that, and that's how they get the date of 1446 BCE. Well, then we take the date of 1446 BCE and we line that up with Amhos the second, or I'm sorry, Thutmose the second. It turns out his reign fits the reign of the Pharaoh, and there's guys who've done this whole thing. And then we go back to Amhos, I believe it's Amhos the first. He fits very well with the one who overthrows Pharaoh, and I think it's Amhos the second fits really well with the Pharaoh that would have had the babies killed. Okay, so we have all these people that just line up perfectly once you get your dating right. And the guys on Patterns of Evidence kind of detail this stuff, so I would highly recommend you guys watching that video or even buying that video because it just lines up a lot of stuff. Now, the guys on Patterns of Evidence don't believe that the Hyksos are the Hebrews. They believe the Hyksos are Semitic people who ruled Egypt, which allowed the Hebrews to have favor with Pharaoh. I don't believe that. I believe the Hyksos are the Hebrews. I believe that they're the Hebrews, and then the Egyptians that ruled with them are the Copts. And the reason is because the Copts is where you get the name Kaftor, the Kaftorim, or you have a city named Kift, Qift, or it's sometimes called Geftu, which is right near Thebes, and then they call Crete Keft because it's taken over by the Copts, and then you have a Thebes in Athens that seems to have been established by Danites and Egyptians. It's about 100 miles away from Athens, okay? And so we have the Greeks that give us testimony of these four cities that were built by the Danans. We also have the Tuatha Danann in Ireland who supposedly come from these four cities, okay? And those cities are Argos, which is in Peloponnese, so that's like the southern peninsula of Greece. Mycenae, which is in Peloponnese. Knossos, which is in Crete. And then Thebes, which is, like I said, like 100 miles away from Athens. So it seems like all of these cities were established by the Danites and the Egyptians when they were partners with, before they went into slavery. So you got like a century of that. And then what you have is you have numerous prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about how the Philistines came from Caftor. Well, Caftor is Crete, and the Philistines are believed to have not entirely come from Caftor, but they basically are going to come from. They're an Egyptian tribe, and it says they're descended from this tribe named Kelsuhim, but they came from Caftor, which is Crete, and that's where they come and keep populating the shores of Gaza from, and then they have connections to the bronze trade all the way over to England, and that's how they have the tin and the copper they need to make bronze, because they once controlled Cyprus, where copper comes from, and then Crete had connections from the Greeks all the way out to Tarshish, which is where silver and tin and stuff like that comes from. And so the whole, what they call the Minoan civilization, is really a civilization that is a mixture of Caftorite Egyptians, Philistines, which are Chalcedonian Egyptians, Danites, and then Greeks. That's who the Minoan civilization is. Okay, so so we know that from the Karnak Kings list is like you have a Kings list that is composed right around the time the Jews flee from the Exodus, that deletes the Hyksos, which are the Israelites. It deletes them. Well, the Egyptians, we know, are known for deleting parts of their history that they see as blasphemous or shameful. They just delete it. Well, eventually you're going to have problems if you're deleting history, because you're going to need to fill in those gaps of history with other things, and that's what they do. So the other kings list we have the Abydos kings list, we have the Karnak's kings list is the first one. And then we have the Turin's Kings list, the Abydos Kings list, and there's one more. I'm trying to think. Oh, and then the third one is the Saqqara tablet. And this is a Kings list that goes from Ramses II, and it goes all the way back to Thutmose I. Okay, so the Saqqara tablet basically records the dynasty that this is literally from. The father of the guy who gets overthrown, or who gets overthrown by Yahweh. So the 10 plagues happens during Thutmose II. So it starts from his father, and it goes down to Ramses II. Okay. No, I'm sorry. This is a different row. That's the thought. Those are the ones who are around when the Jews leave and flee in the Exodus. This one they have goes all the way back to Menkahor, and it's got 58 names on it. And it ends with Ramses II. But we see guys like Khufu and Djoser in this one. And this is supposedly going all the way back to the beginning of Egypt, okay? Now, I want you to see how different these are, okay? Notice we've got Khufu at 42, so this is backwards, okay? So you want to see 42 to 58. That means he's the 16th king. And then you have Djoser at 47, so from 58, he's the 11th king. So notice that list, okay? Now we go to the Abydos kings list, and they say Jer is Djoser, and he's the 3rd king. Well, where's Khufu? No, I'm sorry. You have Djoser as the 16th king, and you have Khusu as the 21st king. So we've got 16, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 kings between them. Let's compare those lists. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 between them. So we have those two lined up, which means they're lining it up from a common record. But how many kings do you have before Djoser? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you have 12 kings. So what do we find from the From the Saqqara tablet, well, they erased 4 kings, okay? But it's not just these 4 that get erased. Now, you have names that are destroyed. When you see name destroyed, that just means the physical name is destroyed off the tablet. Well, sometimes this can be deliberate because they'll erase kings after the fact. Sometimes it's just damage, okay? But the point is what we have. Notice we have Unis right here. So he is of 58, he's 27, so he's the 31st. So let's see where Unis is on these other ones. So you see Menes, and then way down here you have Djoser, and then down here you have Khufu, and Unis is the 33rd on this list, okay? So this is the Abydos kings list. He's the 33rd on this list. Unis is the 27th on this kings list. You've got 6 kings missing. Well, all of these were composed under Ramses II. So what are they? They're different submissions for being the official kings list. Now, what ends up becoming the official kings list, which roughly matches up with the Turin's kings list, because the Turin's kings list is kind of the final, we see this is the first one that accounts their earliest kings as the gods, okay? So what are they doing? They're doing the exact same thing the Sumerians kings list did, which is trying to legitimize their rule based on descending from the gods. And what they're trying to claim is that all of Egypt, which is supposedly the dominant country in the world in their estimation, was always descended from the gods and ruled by different people in succession, in clear succession to each other. And if you look at these are all supposed to be gods. These are all supposed to be demigods or second generation gods or whatever. So you see guys like Set, you see Horus, even though this is potentially Horus here, it seems like. But these seem to be based on the people who were worshipped in the pre-flood era. And what I estimate these to be is a handful of gods that are based on the same Sumerian gods, and then people who were notable in Egypt for inventing their writing system, their legal system, and their scribal system, so their record-keeping system, okay? And then in the next generation, you see guys like Meni. This is Min, who becomes Menes, the first pharaoh. You see Set, you see Horus. These are other gods. Hepu is where the Apis bull comes from. Hab is where Ibis comes from. So these, Iraeus is the serpent god. These are all gods that are in that second row. And then you see this third row, which is, notice it says followers of Horus and spirits, okay? There are these pharaohs who had Horus names because Horus was one of the first people deified because he's based on Enoch, I believe. And then you have these spirit kings, which are basically kings who they believe to be possessed by the spirits of the gods that came before him. So what do I expect these to be? I expect these to be demonized guys. I expect some of these guys probably to be based on Nephilim. And then they get down to their normal human kings list, and it starts with Meni or Menes. But they also had a god named Min and a god named Mantu. And you find these in the theophoric names of the stuff that are more clear. You find Mantu Hotep, which means like Mantu is satisfied. So Meni or Mantu or Min might all be the same guy, okay? What we don't have anywhere in the Egyptian kings list, even though we have names like Ammon and Khnum, which seem like Ham and Canaan, all over the Egyptian kings list, what we don't have anywhere is Mizraim, which is weird because Mizor is in the Phoenician histories, and Musar is in the Assyrian histories as the patriarch of the Egyptians, and of course the Hebrews call him Mitzar, or the people as a plural, Mitzrayim, okay? So we have lots of testimony outside of Egypt of Mitzar being their forefather, but none in Egypt, and this is why people assume that Menes is Mitzar. The problem is they have a god named Min, who I don't want to show you his picture because he just has a big erection. And then they have this Mantu, who seems to be a war god. And they seem to be two different gods, but you got to remember the Egyptians were 7 nations at the Tower of Babel, which means you probably have the same gods pronounced differently by different Egyptians. And typically, when you see Mantu, that U at the end, that tends to be, it seems like Canaanite, for like the people of. And that might be their way of saying Mizraim, or it might be saying the people of Min or Mini, okay? And then it just becomes the god Mantu. But they have, here's the guys they have. Notice you have Meni, Jer, Jet, and then where's Joser? Way down here, okay? So now on this list, this is the Turin Kings list. Notice where he is next to Meni. You have Meni is 11. He is 25, so he's 16th on that list. So that's where he ends up being finalized, but he starts out being 11th, okay? So what are they doing? Well, they're coming up with different king's name. There's Unis, as you notice, he's 25th on that list after 11 through 25, 14 on that list, which means he's like 40th on this list. Okay, so here's Unis. Where's Unis on this list? 33rd. There's seven kings missing. Okay, so when you look at these things, again, this is the Abydos kings list. This is the Turin. This is the Saqqara tablet. Notice he's 27 on this one, 33rd on this one, and 40th on this one. So we just have this King Unis, who seems to be significant. And Djoser is the king that they say built the pyramids. Okay? This is how these guys go back and take this Saqqara tablet, or this Palermo stone, and say, this was made in 2450 BC. How? They take the Turin's list, which is roughly corresponds to Manetho's list, and they say it lines up with that. And based on that, and based on Manetho's list, this is when they rule. So what they do is they take Manetho's history. Now, here's the thing. Here's the stuff that Manetho's history was based on, and guess what we don't have here? Dates. We don't have what years they ruled. So where's Manetho getting this from? Oral history? Papyrus that's now lost? We don't know. But here's what we do know. The Palermo stone gives you all this information about how high the Nile flood was, what the seasonal festivals are, when the flood started, and notable architecture, wars, and achievements of these various kings, okay? This was probably, maybe it was original, maybe it wasn't, we don't know, but this was probably based on pre-flood records. And it's probably this or something like this, which becomes the basis of Ham and Canaan figuring out how to read their language and reconstruct their culture, basically. Okay? So if we have all these details in this very old record, well, why don't we have them in these new records? We don't know, but here's what we do know. If Manetho's history is based on the Turin's Kings list or the Saqqara tablet or any of these things, and they don't have the dates that these kings ruled or anything to align them to history, where's Manetho getting it from? And the answer is he's probably making it up, or they've been, theoretically putting it together over all these years, okay? Whatever records they have, we don't have them anymore. But what we do have that's much, much older than them doesn't have the information that they claim to have. So if these guys didn't have it 1,000 years earlier, where's Manetho getting it from? And the answer is he's probably making it up. Or the Egyptian priesthood is probably making it up. And what are they aligning it to? Probably the Sumerians' kings list. Because you got to remember, the Egyptians and the Babylonians are talking the entire time. You have the Babylonians under the Kassites, which is the people who are ruling when the Jews come out of Egypt, and they're trying to secure a marriage alliance with Egypt. And they get some nobles they get them to allow some of their noble women to go over and marry, but they're trying to get a daughter of the Pharaoh to marry them. And Egypt's like, no, the Pharaoh's daughters don't leave the country. Like, we do not let the Pharaoh's daughters go abroad, okay? Well, they did in Solomon's day, but that was right next door to them, and they considered Canaan kind of, their turf. They actually had cities there, okay? So, when Solomon marries the Pharaoh's daughter, the Pharaoh comes in and conquers a bunch of cities around that and gives them to his daughter, okay? So, the Pharaohs would say to the Babylonians, no, we're not going to give you a daughter, but that proves they're talking. And if they're talking then, well, we know in the days of the Alexandrian Library, we have Berosus of Alexandria who's writing a king's list for them. Well, what's he basing it on? It has to be the Sumerians' king's list or things that are like it or based on it, okay? We know we have an Assyrians' king's list, which goes all the way back, it seems to go back to the pre-flood era. which seems to be the rulers that ruled in Assyria before the flood, followed by the rulers that ruled after the flood. And that seems to not align with the Sumerians' kings list, even though it mentions Sargon and Naram-Sin in the exact same order that you would expect them, and in the exact same timing you would expect them in terms of how many years they ruled. So of all these kings lists that I have looked at, the one that seems the most reliable is the Assyrians' kings list. And that makes sense because Assyria would have had cities and culture established from the time of Sargon. And what they claim in their history is that before, they talk about these kings who lived in tents. Okay, so these are the people who were probably there before the flood and they were tent dwellers. And then after the flood, they probably had towns. And then when Sargon came there, they had fortified cities. And it's from that time they seem to have started keeping their records, but they seem to have had stuff that was inscribed before that, probably on rocks or something like that, that they were able to understand to be, the people before the flood. Okay, so the Assyrians' kings list seem to be the best. They have all this cuneiform. I mean, tons and tons, because the Assyrians had huge libraries of Assyrian cuneiform tablets that was going back to their ancient history, and so they seem to have been archaeologists too. But when we find this stuff and we line it up with the Sumerians' kings list, it doesn't line up, which means the Sumerians' kings list is BS, and the Turin Kings list, which is modeled on the Sumerians Kings list, is also BS. What are they doing? What is the Turin Kings list doing? Well, the Turin Kings list is doing the exact same thing the Sumerians Kings list is doing, which is trying to push the flood back so that they can claim descent from the gods. Now, the Turin Kings list doesn't even account a flood. Manetho does. But there's nothing that we see here that mentions a flood, and I've done research and I can't find any mention of the flood here, okay? But what they do is they have gods followed by demigods followed by these demonized kings, okay? And then you have them get down to Menes, which people try to line up with Mizraim. I don't think he is Mizraim. I think he's Min or Montu, one of these two. And they're trying to attach Montu because you have Montu is satisfied, and Montuhotep, and all these names of these Hamitic kings, but they don't know where it came from. Well, Montu was probably, again, a pre-flood Nephilim warlord. That's what he seems to be. That the Egyptians, after Ham and Canaan, are attaching to their name, because it doesn't seem to be related to any Hamitic line. But then they have Ham as Ammon, Canaan as Canum. They have Sin as Sen. They have this guy named, I think his name is Sobek, who seems to be based on Cush's son Sheba. And then they have, trying to remember who else. Okay, then they have Isis and Osiris, which is Inanna and Dumuzid. Like I said, I believe Horus is Enoch. And then Set is based on Seth, Adam's firstborn. Adam is called Atum, who is considered their original father of the gods, and then they merge him with Ra as Atum Ra, and it becomes another name for the sun god. Ra doesn't seem to originally be the sun god, because his original symbol is a mouth, which means he's probably the word of the Lord. And then they attach the sun symbol to him, and the word for sun is Ra. Well, China has the exact same symbol in the Shang dynasty, and it's Ri, and it's their symbol for the sun. And then they have Qi, which is their symbol for life force and energy. Just like the Egyptians have Ra and Ka, the Chinese have Ri and Qi. Okay, so clearly the Chinese got their stuff from the Egyptians, and the Sinites, who become the Chinese, used to be in the Wilderness of Sin, or the Sinai Peninsula, which is right next to Egypt, which makes sense that they would have gotten that Egyptian lore and brought it with them to China. So that takes us to these lists. Well, what are these lists? Well, these lists, which were basically put together, and I'm sure that Manetho had access to other records that had more information than just what's on these lists, because these lists just had names. But these lists, what they were, was a bunch of different dynasties, some of them that were competing and at the same time. And then what he does is he slaps them into lists, because what is he trying to prove? He's trying to prove that Egypt is older than Babylon. And since Babylon goes back to Akkad, which is in Akkad and Kish and that stuff goes all the way back in the Sumerians kings list to, let's see here. In the Akkad's kings list, you would have this being roughly 2350. So they would claim that they inherited the dynasty from Kish around 2350. Well, they got to prove that they're older than that, because Akkad had world government. This is why Sumer and Akkad claimed world government. They claimed successive world government going all the way up to Hammurabi, which is going to fall at the Tower of Babel, and that's the point when Egypt takes over as the world hegemon. Okay, it becomes the most powerful and most, oldest culture in the world. Okay, and so they have to go back at least to 2350 to establish themselves as being older than Babylon, because after this, during the days of Ramses, the Kassites, who are descended from Cush, are claiming that they have more ancient heritage. And that's why they're trying to get a wife from the Egyptians. And this would be around the time of Ramses II. So the whole period with the Amun-Ra letters and this stuff, this is literally from Akhenaten, who tries to bring them all back to monotheistic sun worship, down to Ramses. This is all over the course of about less than a century. And it's during this century that the Kassites are still powerful in Babylon. They've lost a huge battle to Othniel, who is Caleb's brother. You're going to read about this Kushan double something evil, something like that, who they fight, who comes from basically Syria. And they're going to defeat him, which is basically the Kassite Babylonians who are ruling over, at that time, their relatives of the Aram Naharim, or the Mitanni, and they defeat them. And after that, the Kassites go into decline. But they're claiming to be ancient, and Ramses II is going to be around that time. He is, let me see, so I have Othniel's victory over the Kassites in 1383. Ramses II is going to be 1285. So it's actually at the end of the 80 years, or it's after Ehud, or it's before Ehud, and so it's actually during this period of the 40 years of peace that Othniel creates, I believe, or during the 80 years that Ehud creates. Because you see, he's lined up with Tutankhamun, he's lined up with Akhenaten, and then I believe the Battle of Kadesh right here in 1274, that is Ramses II. And that's Egypt's kind of last great attempt to try to retake Canaan. And this is when they're fighting the Hittites as their main rival. Well, the Jews have beat the Hittites. The Jews have beat the Kassites. And Yahweh has beaten the Egyptians. And so all of these guys are getting weakened, and the Jews are rising to power. This is heading towards David and Solomon's kingdom, about 250 years after this. Okay, so these things are roughly lined up, and what you have with Ramses II, I believe he does account the Hyksos. Let's see here, Turin's Kings list. So they are accounted in the Turin's Kings list, but remember, the Jews have been gone now for a couple hundred years. So the shame of just having gotten their butts kicked by them is kind of dissipated by then. And what Ramses is trying to do, again, is prove an unbroken succession of rule over all of Egypt, going back to older than the Sumerians Kings list. And so what do you end up with in Manetho's Kings list is something like this. So what we have from Manetho's Kings list, we don't have his original book. What we have is accounts of his book from Julius Africanus, who is essentially a Libyan Christian, Eusebius, who is a Caesarean Christian, so he's going to be in the Phoenician area. And then there's somebody else who's Armenian, and I forget who it is, but these are three different people who had access to his book who wrote stuff about it. And you see they have disagreement, 62, 60, 30, 57, 27, 27, 31, 39, 39. So the copies of his book they have don't always agree, but they mostly agree, okay? So if we look at the three different, they're off by a year when you're accounting this first generation. And see, you have Menes at the top. Josephus had access to this too. We know he notes some stuff in it. So what we have is essentially coming from secondhand sources, people who had copies of it, and those copies don't always agree. And if you go down these lists, we're looking for kings like Djoser and Unas. Okay. Now remember, Djoser and Unas are going to be roughly in the 15th, 16th king down to the 13th king. So we're going all the way up to 8. Nothing that looks like Jonas. Nothing that looks like Unas. And then we've got Khufu down here. So Khufu is the second in the 4th dynasty. So we're going to see how many were before him. We've got 9. We've got 18. We've got 26. And then we've got the gods. We're not going to count the gods. So we have 26 people until we get to Khufu. Okay? Now let's look at Khufu here in the Palermo stone. He's not in there. We've got, oh yeah, here he is right here. He's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He's 10th in the Palermo stone, which is supposedly their oldest thing, but he's 25th in Manetho's list. Okay? That's how much they're changing it. They keep adding more kings. Now let's look at longer lists, because again, this is supposedly their oldest thing that was scribed in stone. We just don't know exactly when it was written. There's dispute over it. The Saqqara tablet, when's Khufu? So we see Unas there. We see Khufu 42nd. 42nd in the King's list, or in the Saqqara tablet, okay? So he's 42nd in the Saqqara tablet. In the Abydos King's list, he is 21st. 21 king. He's the 21st king in this list, the 42nd king in this list. Let's see where he is in the Turin's King's list. So here's the point I'm making. These are all the kings lists that we know of in Egypt. And when we look at Manetho and all the different versions of Manetho which we have, which even though they're off, look at the amount of time they have, 1,095 to 1,000. That's the whole range, okay? The whole range is 150 years difference, okay? Even though we got 3 different copies of this thing. Then we get to the 5th dynasty. We're up to 1,295 years. Here's the problem. Do you know when the Hyksos or the Hebrews were there? They're like the 15th dynasty. So we keep going, and we're up to, look at some of these dynasties. Oop, nothing. We got nothing for whole dynasties. Between dynasties, we've got people that are, because they have these intermediate periods where it's not a clear dynasty. Now we're Ammon-Nemes, okay? So Ammon is obviously based on Ammon, the god, and Nemes, I don't know what that means. But we're up to 2,300 years from the beginning of Egypt, which, again, they're going to claim all of this is post-flood, okay? Even if you're using the LXX chronology and all this is post-flood, We get to the 15th dynasty, which is the Hebrews. Which we have Africanus is 151 years. Eusebius and the Armenians say 103 years. 103. This 103 years lines up with how long the Israelites were there before they got put into captivity. That lines up very well. But the point is where is this in their total history? Well, if we have that 103 or 150 years, notice how big of a change that is. And then we go back to another one. This is 16th. We've got an earlier dynasty of shepherd kings from Phoenicia, 284 years. What are they talking about there? 484 years. 245 years, or as low as 160 years. And you go back, and the point is we've got thousands, we've got hundreds of years of discrepancy, but we've got thousands of years of history between the flood and the Jews in Egypt. Well, let's go to the LXX. When are the Jews in Egypt compared to this? Well, here's the Masoretic. And they go into Egypt 2,500 years from Adam. 2,500 years from Adam. And what you do is you add about 1,100 years to get the LXX timeline. So you have 3,500 years from Adam into the flood. Now you no, I'm sorry. You had I think it's like 1,200 years to get the Masoretic timeline. So you're at 3,600 years. The problem is you have 1,600 years to the flood. So you still just have 2,000 years between the flood and the Jews being in Egypt. Well, we're up to 2,000 years. Remember, they need 2,500 years, maybe tops. It's probably more closer to 2,000 years. We're up to 1,900 years by the time we get to the 11th dynasty. We've got 4 more dynasties to go. And so by the time we get to this, notice there's another 500 years. There's another 245 years. There's another 484 years. How long is this till we get to the Hyksos? It doesn't match with anything in the LXX, but here's what the Jews do in the days of the LXX. They just take the total timeline of Manetho's Egyptica that's around their day, they match up the Hebrews, and then they just add 100 years to everything so they can take it back to having... Because if they didn't, Egypt would be like, our kingdoms are older than your whole Bible. They're older than Adam. So that proves that your Bible's bunk. So what they do is they just add 100, and rather than challenging the Egyptian lies, they add 100 years to everything to make everything older than that. So now at least you have Adam being older than the Egyptian kingdom. Well, what about the flood? Yeah, that's another huge problem. But they don't really deal with that problem. They just make it older than Adam. Or they make it older than Egypt, okay? Now, they only make it a few hundred years older than Egypt, which still creates a huge problem with where the flood is. But the Jews by this time seem to be adopting their idea that maybe there's just periodic floods. Maybe there's multiple floods, okay? That's the only thing they can make sense of it. But here's the problem that they have. And this is something that the Jews don't reconcile. The Jews need to utterly destroy the Egyptian chronological history in order to validate the Bible, but they don't try to do that. They try to align with it. And here's what's wrong with this. Look at the reign of their first king, 62 years. 57 years or 27 years. You know what a problem is with these reigns? According to the Jews, the people from Adam to Seth aren't having kids until they're over 200. And after the flood, they're not having kids till they're over 100. So how can you have a guy rule for 62 years and then the next guy 57 years and the next guy, because he wouldn't even have a kid until this guy, until the third generation after him. See, there is no way you can line up the LXX with these histories. Your proponents of the LXX timelines, and I'm telling you, they're all over the internet. They're multiplying because of Michael Heiser. I just got on this Just Scripture Ministries, and all these guys are talking about it. All these people are trying to, your scholars, are trying to say that the LXX is the better translation because the LXX is quoted more by the apostles. Well, we don't know that. All we know that Greek renditions of things are closer to the LXX, which the oldest version we have is literally from the Codex Alexandrinus. That's where it comes from, which is 300 AD. We don't have the ancient Septuagint. Nobody has the ancient Septuagint. But what we have, we know that when the apostles are citing stuff from the Old Testament in Greek, it sounds more like the LXX. Now, we do know certain things they quoted from the LXX because, like, Stephen is going to say that there were 75 souls in Egypt, which is in the LXX, okay? Here's the big problem with that, though. The 75 souls in Egypt that they're talking about are in Genesis 46. And when you read this, this is literally accounting the souls that come into Egypt with Joseph. And notice it says, all the souls of the house of Jacob who came with Joseph into Egypt were 75 souls. Okay? Pay attention to what it's saying. How do they get to 75? And there were sons born to Manasseh, which the Syrian concubine bore to him, even Machir. And Machir begot Gilad. So they've got Machir and Gilad added. And the sons of Ephraim, the brother of Manasseh, Sudalam and Tam, and the sons of Sudalam, Edom. So they've got the grandchildren of Manasseh and Ephraim added to this list to get to 75 souls. Do you know what the problem is with that? Ephraim and Manasseh were born right before the famine. It says write that in the earlier chapters. You just go a chapter earlier, and it says, if you go to chapter 42, or I'm sorry, if you go to chapter 41, it says, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the 7 years of the famine came. So Joseph gives Pharaoh his dream that says there's going to be 7 good years and then 7 years of famine. And in the 7 good years, that's when Manasseh and Ephraim are born. So when is Jacob and those guys going to come into Egypt? Well, it says they come into Egypt in like the 3rd year of the famine. It's like the 2nd and a half year of the famine, okay? So these kids are at most like 9 years old by the time Jacob gets in there. How do they have grandchildren listed in the 75 souls? Now, I will point this stuff out to people who are into the Septuagint because the scholars tell you it's the Septuagint is better, okay? And here's the problem. I will show these guys and be like, look at this. How can his grandchildren be how can the grandchildren of Ephraim and Manasseh, the great-grandchildren of Joseph, be counted in the 75 souls that went into Egypt? The only people who have grandchildren in this entire list is like, I think Levi? No, Levi's just got children. I think Judah has grandchildren. I think he's the only one. There might be some other ones that have grandchildren, but for the most part, look at the sons of Judah, Annan, Pharez, and Zerah, because he has Pharez and Zerah with his daughter-in-law. And then it says, and Anan died in the land, okay? This that you have in the Septuagint, you also have the grandchildren of Benjamin listed. It says Benjamin, Bala, Bochar, and Asbel. In the Masoretic, it's not his grandchildren. He just has a lot of children. And then it says, and the sons of Bala were Gera and Noman and Akos and Ross and Maphim. So apparently Benjamin, who is the youngest, somehow has 6 grandchildren when his brothers that are older than him by up to 50 years, only one of them has a grandkid. Only Judah has grandchildren. Do you see how messed up this is? It doesn't make sense just with itself. But now let's get to some other big problems. If we want to go to Genesis 11, they're going to try to tell you, the Jews are going to try to tell you, the Second Temple Jews who just get everything wrong and Christ rebukes them for not knowing their scriptures. They say that Arphaxad begot Canaan. Only they forgot to update Chronicles to match that. Well, you know why they couldn't update Chronicles to match this? Because this was originally written way before, and then it was translated into Aramaic in around the 6th century BC. Chronicles was written probably in the 4th century BC. Because Chronicles ends with the beginning of Ezra, which means it's written around the same time as Ezra. And Ezra is going to be literally, his actual reign as priest is going to be in the late 5th century. Okay? Well, if this is just the early, I believe it's the early 3rd century that this is written, you're talking about 150, 200 years from the original writing of Chronicles, which means, guess what? A bunch of people have copies of Chronicles and they can all call BS. So they don't update Chronicles, they just update Genesis. Well, what are they updating? Where are they getting this Canaan from? They're getting this Canaan from the Book of Jubilees. Well, where is this Canaan coming from? In the Book of Jubilees, he's not spelled Canaan like this. The Jews don't actually use this C. Well, they do, but it's a K sound, okay? The Canaan that's in the Book of Jubilees is a K, and it ends with an M, Canaan, which is the Egyptian god Khnum. How do I know this? Because the Jews had a temple on Elephantine Island, and you guys might have heard of this temple on Elephantine Island, because there was a rumor that the Ethiopians claimed, and the Ethiopians are just full of Gnostic writings and full of fake Jewish writings, okay? On Elephantine Island, this was known for temples back in the day. Now it's just apparently known for some rich resorts and stuff. But Elephantine Island had a temple of Khnum, and then a Jewish temple on it. It had another temple from some goddess, I forget, but it had a Jewish temple on it. And the reason it has a Jewish temple on it is because when the Persians take over Egypt, they put a Jewish garrison right here. They put a Jewish garrison right around here, and the Jews built a replica of Solomon's temple on Elephantine Island so they can have their own priesthood and carry out the law of Moses in their area. So what the Ethiopians are going to claim is that this replica temple was built to hold the real Ark of the Covenant, which was taken, they said, during the reign of, I think it was Manasseh or something like that, who is like the wicked king who puts idols in the temple and stuff like this. They said the priests left and they took the altar here to Elephantine Island, and now it's in Ethiopia. Well, the Ethiopians also like to lie and say that they're descended from Solomon and weird stuff like this, which is just not true, okay? What we know is that this temple wasn't built until the Jews got there. Now, I've heard this my whole life until I researched it and realized we know archaeologically that there were Jews here under the Persians, and then those Jews built a temple on Elephantine Island so they could carry out their worship. It was a garrison of Jewish troops down here. And this was not until around the... this would have been about the 4th or 5th century, okay? This is during the reign of, I think it was Cambyses, who was Cyrus's son. This is when this happens, okay? So Cyrus is the one who sends him back to rebuild the temple. They're not even done rebuilding the temple yet because it's going to take a while. It's actually going to take till almost the end of the 6th century for them to rebuild it. And then his son's going to take over Egypt, and he's going to station these Jews here, and they're going to have 2 competing temples and 2 competing priesthoods. This is where your Essenes come from. They're claiming to be the priesthood that was kicked out when the Sadducees took over. That's not true. They're this priesthood right here. And so they're going to have all kinds of ideas that are mixed in from the Egyptians and the Babylonian astrologers and all this stuff, and then they're going to end up forming the Qumran community. They're going to have all kinds of false prophecies and all kinds of so-called ancient writings, which they're going to claim that they got from angels, and they're just liars. Well, that's because the Jews who went into Egypt were worshipers of like Isis and Osiris and stuff like this. We know this. It's right in the book of Jeremiah. They're burning cakes to the Queen of Heaven, which is Isis, and mourning for Tammuz, which is Osiris. Okay, so we know this. We know they were corrupt. We know they were mixing things with Egypt. And you have Jews down here near Elephantine Island. You have Jews up here in Sais, which is the same city where Solon is getting convinced that he is not, that the flood was just a local event. The same place where the Egyptians are saying that the Jews go, because one of Josiah's sons gets taken there to Egypt until he dies. And he's not taken there alone. He's probably got an entourage of Jews with him, and there's probably a community that forms around them. And then those Jews, after Sais stops being the capital, are going to go, because I think it gets It's during the Ptolemaic period that after the Persians that Sais stops being the capital. Now the capital becomes, or the not the capital, but the main trade city essentially becomes Alexandria, and the Jews are going to go there. And it's there under Ptolemy II that they make the Septuagint, the LXX, 10 years after Manetho's Aegyptica. And so what is Manetho trying to prove? Well, we're older than Babylon. Because that's what he's trying to prove from the days of Ramses. This is all of this stuff comes from the days of Ramses, except for the Karnak list and the Palermo stone. We don't know where the Palermo stone comes from. We know the Karnak list comes from Thutmose II, right after the Jews leave. Okay, so Manetho is going to have stuff that's from the Turin stone. He's going to talk about how the Hyksos were these marauders who came in and they just took everything by force. Manetho is going to say, no, they came in without a battle because there was some judgment from God that happened. Well, when I start studying these different dynasties that led up to the Hyksos being there, I can go to the 13th dynasty. And what we find in these dynasties, the 13th, 14th dynasty, is we find a big, long famine at the end of their dynasties. Well, what happened? Some of them specifically mention a 7-year famine. Well, this is the 13th, 14th dynasty. The 15th dynasty is the Hyksos. But if you keep going back, and you go back to the 11th dynasty, it ends with 7 empty years. Well, why do all these dynasties seem to keep accounting long famines? The answer is because they're not a bunch of dynasties. That would be like Egypt having a big long famine every dynasty. So look at this dynasty is from 2151 to 1991. Every 100, 200 years, they have a 7-year famine. Well, that would be notable in the Bible, wouldn't it? No, it's because they're taking a bunch of different dynasties. Remember, at the Tower of Babel, they become 7 nations, okay? And so we have a bunch of different dynasties that end with a 7-year famine. Well, what happens in the Bible after the 7-year famine? Well, it tells you. You have in Genesis 41. It says the famine was all over the face of the earth. So this is a worldwide famine. Well, we have this accounted in Babylonia in the Atrahasis myth. They talk about a 6-year famine and them eating the grain stores in the first year. That's literally written in the days of Hammurabi's great-grandson. So probably within a century of Babylon, they're accounting a 6-year famine and eating the grain stores in the first year in their myths. Okay? Then we go to Genesis, let's see, 40, I believe it's 46. No, it's 47. And it says, there was no bread in the land. The famine was very sore, so that all the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. So Egypt is going to get control of all of Canaan, and all of Egypt, turning all the people into peasants because of this famine. It says, Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought, and Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's house. And when the money failed to the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph, said, give us bread. Why should we die in thy presence? Thy money fails. So Joseph said, give us your cattle, and we'll give you grain for your cattle if your money fails. And he says they brought the cattle to Joseph, so he basically bought all their horses, all their flocks, all their herds, everything, okay? All the way into Canaan and all of Egypt. Then when that year was ended, notice it said, here's the second year. He said, we will not hide it from our Lord. Their money is spent, and so are our herds and cattle. There's nothing left but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes? Buy us our land and our body for bread, that we will live and become servants of Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, that we may not be desolate. So they ate all their seed. They've got nothing left to plant, okay? They all become serfs under Pharaoh. This is what happens. All of Egypt and all of Canaan. So it says, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and the Egyptians sold every man his field because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them from cities to one end of the borders of Egypt to the other land. Only the land of the priests he bought not. And the priests' portion was assigned to them of Pharaoh, and they ate the portion that Pharaoh gave them. In other words, the priests are getting paid by the pharaohs. Why? Because the pharaohs pay the priests for these big, huge burial rituals that they got to go through, because they're deceived into thinking they need to do this to be reincarnated in the afterlife, basically. So he says, this day I bought your land for Pharaoh. Here's seed to sow the land. And he basically, what he does is he allows them to live on their land as serfs to plant and sow, but they have to give, the land belongs to Pharaoh, and they have to give him a 20% tithe. So he essentially converts them to being pharaohs of the land that they, or stewards of the land they once owned, giving 20% to Pharaoh and keeping the rest. Okay? So this is what he does to all Egypt. Well, what does that mean about all these dynasties that end in a 7-year famine? Well, that's because they're not successive dynasties that all end in a 7-year famine. They're a bunch of dynasties that all end at the same time in Joseph. And so what are they doing? These priests, after the fact, are collecting all of these dynasties that end. Because before this, all of them account that Egypt wasn't unified. You have a bunch of different people claiming the rule of all of Egypt, and they know this, okay? So what do? They take all their genealogies, and this is why these people all have short lives and short reigns. None of them live hundreds of years. It's because they all just go back probably a few hundred years from the time of Abraham onward. So you have maybe 200-300 years of people. And these dynasties, which are all each about 200 years to 500 years, this is how long they are actually the 7 tribes of Egypt, or the 7 nations of Egypt from the Tower of Babel, all coming to consolidation under Pharaoh. And so what you end up with in Egypt is you're going to have the Old Kingdom period, which is really the pre-flood era, which is probably what is depicted in this Palermo stone, or the Palermo stone was a copy of it. But it does talk about a god named Canaan. Well, that Canaan could be Canaan, and also the Canaan that is before the flood. So you have a Canaan who's going to be the son of Enosh, and you have a Set who is Seth, which would be his grandfather. And these guys could be based on Atom is Adam, Set is Seth, and Canaan is Canaan, his grandson. And Enosh, which means the priesthood is established, stays as the priest over in Sumer. And then after him is Enoch. So if you go look at these people in the Genesis 5, you could have, there's Atom of Egypt, there's Set of Egypt, there's Canaan of Egypt, there's the first established priest, Enosh, of who is in Sumer. Mahalalel, I don't know where he is, but you do have Enoch, which is Enki, and Jared, which is his father, is the name of Eridu, which means of Jared. So all of these guys seem to be accounted in Egypt or Sumer. I mean, this is everybody all the way down to Enoch. Once you're down to Enoch, or who is Enki, all you have is Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And Methuselah dies right before the flood. Lamech is Noah's father. He dies a few years before that, and Noah goes in the flood. And these guys would have had to have gone up into Turkey to build the ark to get away from all the warfare. So you literally have, in the god names of these people, everybody accounted that I can find except for Mahalalel. That's the only one I can't find, which maybe he's there. Who knows? You do have a Maluha, which is accounted as the name for India, but I don't think that's it. I think that there's Canaanites, and I think it means land of flowing rivers or something like that. So it makes sense that the 2 most ancient kingdoms in the world, Egypt and Sumer, would have been founded by the sons of Seth, and some of them stayed there, and some of them went to Egypt and founded a new colony, because all these guys are going to live until around within 500 years of the flood. And so then after that, it goes into warfare after they all start to die, and you're down to, remember, Enoch is going to get translated, but Jared is going to keep living for a while. I think Jared is going to live after Enoch is translated he says he's going to live 162 years, and he's going to beget Enoch, and he's going to live after Enoch is translated 800 years minus 365 years, so 450 some years. So what's going to happen is 450 years after this is when everybody's died and Enoch is translated, and you're down to Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. So most of these guys are going to die by about 400 years before the flood. And it's after that stuff goes to crap, and people start worshiping all these cults, and then they start going into warfare all over the place. All of the forefathers, the righteous forefathers, are all dead. And so it just goes to chaos after that. So it makes sense that after that you have guys like this warlord Mantu popping up, and this Min who is known for his big erection that he thinks is magical powers. It makes sense that all that stuff is there. Okay? So, moral of the story of this, what is this? The Sumerians Kings List, we've talked about this in other videos. It is jacked up to make basically a COD look like it is legitimate when it's trying to take over the world, when in fact what they're doing is they're using pre-flood wars and offenses as an excuse to wage war. That's what they're doing, okay? There's not really war anywhere else in the world. So fast forward to Ramses. Remember, Ramses II is when most of this stuff takes place. Ramses is going to be about 1200. This is actually going to be around 1800. It's not 2300, okay? I think Sargon is going to be like late 1900s. So he's gonna do his thing right after Noah dies, based on the Masoretic text. So it's within like 20 years of Noah dying, he tries to take over the world. And the reason is because Noah sets up Shem when they had this pre-existing Hamitic world order. So I'm accounting all this stuff based on theophoric names in my Serpent by the Way book, but it's, even if you thought the possibility that the Canaan is not based on the Canaan, it's based on the pre-flood Canaan, which it could be, you still are going to have guys like, notice these names, Ra is going to be at the end of their name, is a common one. And then when you see Amenemhat, so you've got Amenemhat 1, Amenemhat means Amen is at the head, okay? Amen is Ham, and Ham is basically ruling over Egypt, Sumer, and India, and Nubia. And basically Arabia, okay? Ham is ruling all over that. This is why these pharaohs' names mean Ham is at the head. Mentu seems to be based on that pre-flood Min or Mantu, which is the war god, okay? And that means Mentu is pleased, okay? But you see Amenhotep is first. Amos is based on Ham too. It's Amen is born. That's what that means. So you would probably assume, because they're teaching that their pharaohs are reincarnations of the old gods that died, Amenhotep means Ham is the head. He's probably still alive there. Amhos means Ham is born, which means they're probably counting their pharaoh as a reincarnation of Ham. And notice you have Mentuhotep II. The reason these names are there is probably because they're counting their kings as, remember how they have these demonized kings that they call them like spirit kings and stuff. They believe they're possessed with the spirit of them, and that's how they have their authority. So you see Amenemhat the first. Amenhotep means Amen is pleased. Amos means Amen is born, and Amenhat means Amen is the head. Mentuhotep means Mentu is pleased. Senuseret means Sen is powerful, and Sen seems to be Sign, this would all align with the time that Sign is being deified over in Akkad, which is the father of the Sinaites. Remember, Sign is right, the wilderness of Sin and Mount Sinai is right next door, so they call Sen Sign. And you keep seeing Senuseret, Amenhotep, and then Sobek Neferu he's a crocodile god, and he is Sobi Meker is what they call him in Nubia, and it's clear the other guy is called Didanu. So Rama's two sons are Sheba and Dedan, and Sobek and Soba Meker seem to be based on Sheba. And then you're going to have Ra come into these names. So again, these are the names, and then when you get to Thutmose means Thoth is born, and again, I think Thoth is the creator of their writing system. And so when you look at the older kings lists, the only one of these they have is Ra in their name. You don't see Amen because Ham's not born yet. You see Ra, and then the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza is believed to be Khufu. Well, Khufu, his name means Kanam Khufu, which means Canaan is my protector. So this guy could potentially be based on the Canaan, the pre-flood Canaan. Because that seems to be the oldest instance of Canaan. And they say that the pyramids were built by these guys. Well, based on what I see in the names, I don't see any reference to any of the post-flood guys unless you count Kanam Khufu as the Canaan from after the flood. Okay? I don't think he is. Because you have Kanam's name in the first two homosexuals in Egypt, which seems to be Canaan, because the Canaanites were into homosexuality. And you seem to see Ra, which is the sun god. Horaha basically seems to be based on Horus. And where they date these kings back to, even in their jacked up lineages, is after the death of Adam. Based on the Masoretic is after the death of Adam, which makes sense because nobody would be counting themselves as kings before the death of Adam, because Adam's king of the whole world. There's a one unified government. You might have local, they call them ensies in Sumer, and they call them nomarchs in Egypt, but they're essentially local city-state rulers, like more like mayors or governors, basically, over local farm communities, okay? But you don't see god names in here, with the exception of there's Ra right there, there's Ra right there, and then we knew Khufu is Khufu Kanam, okay? So if that is based on Canaan, that makes sense that all these people are post-Adam, but here's what doesn't make sense if it's post-Adam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Why do you have 16 rulers after Adam if these guys are living to be 1,000 years old? And the answer is because this isn't a unified dynasty either. You have first dynasty, second dynasty, third dynasty, fourth dynasty, fifth dynasty. What does that mean? You probably have 5 families of people ruling over the land that is now called Egypt, and Egypt comes from Gept, which comes from Copt. Okay, so it's a Greek name. It wasn't called Egypt back then. The land, it gets called by Kemet, by probably Ham, probably names it after his wife. Kemet seems to mean Mrs. Ham. That's what Kemet seems to mean. Okay, so I imagine that his wife is buried there. You have the Ogdoad, which is based in the city of Chemnu, which means Ham of Noah, and you have Nu and the 4 sons and their wives as the 8 gods there, and all their wives have et at the end of their name. It's Nun and now Net. It's whatever their names and et at the end. So it basically means Mrs. Noah. Okay. So it was originally called Kemet by Ham, which they say means the Black Land. It doesn't. It means Mrs. Ham. And then if you go all the way down to the Greeks, it becomes Egypt. What was it called before that? We don't know. But what we do know is there's guys who are designated as wearing the white crown and the red crown way back in Egypt, and they say, oh, that represents Upper and Lower Egypt. I don't think it does. I think it starts to represent Upper and Lower Egypt in the days when the rebels from Upper Egypt overthrow the Copts and the Hebrews and turn the Hebrews into slaves, and then they start to use the red crown to represent Upper and Lower Egypt. I think it represented Adam's rule over the Sethites, which are the priesthood, and the Cainites, which are the violent ones. I think that's what the red and white crown signified, was Adam's rule over both lines. Because there were 2 lines, essentially, and the world was divided along those lines, and Adam ruled over all of it. And then after Adam died, you probably had people in Egypt claiming to rule over each. That would be my guess, because again, it's just in their pictures and stuff, and the double crown is associated with Atum, the god Atum, which seems to be Adam. Okay, so what are these? These are probably 5 different families that existed before the flood, and each one of them has, notice you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in that one, you have 2 in that one, you have 2 in that one, you have 4 in that one, and you have 3 in that one. What does that recommend? It recommends that there were a few generations of rulers between Adam and the flood, just like you have in the Bible. With the death of Adam you're going to have like 670 years until the flood, which is going to be less than the lifetime of Noah, but you're going to have a few patriarchs after him. That's it, okay? Because they're going to live almost until the flood. And this is what you have here too. These are probably 5 different kingdoms that are all ruling. And then, so we don't need to say that's hundreds of years or just a bunch of short reigns. That's what they're trying to do. They're making up this stuff to make them short reigns so they can fit it all in. And it doesn't make sense. Why are the patriarchs in the book of Genesis living to be hundreds of years old, but these guys are flipping over rule every 20 years? Well, they're doing the same thing in Sumer too, because they're trying to take a bunch of lists and claim that these people descended from people who lived to be hundreds or thousands of years old, but then all of a sudden you're just like 6 years, 6 years, 6 years, 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 6 years, and then you go right back to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They don't make sense because they're bootleg. They're made up after the fact. They also don't make sense that there's literally differences in these lists that were all made in the same generation of up to 10, 20 kings. They don't make sense unless you put a bunch of them in tandem, and that's what you do. So what I did is I looked through the, at least, remember, there are 7 Egyptian kingdoms, and I just looked at the 11th through 14th, and you have at least 3 that mention a long famine. You have one that mentions 7 empty years. You have a much later story from the 2nd century that talks about Imhotep, who is a priest under Djoser, which is pre-flood, it seems to be. And this story is that he tells Djoser to solve the 7-year famine, and or Djoser tells Imhotep to solve the 7-year famine and build the pyramid. So it's clear that they're making stuff up after the fact. But the point is, this 7-year famine is all over Egypt's history. And then in the dynasty that was right before him in Thebes, which I believe is the dynasty where it's ruled by a woman. Oh, look at these names. When we get to the 14th dynasty, watch this. So the 14th dynasty is the dynasty that rules over the Nile Delta region during the time that the Hebrews were there. This is the one that was conquered among them, okay? Listen to the name of these people they have. Yakbeam Second Ra. You know what this means? This means the Jacobite that causes Ra to shine. That's what the name means, okay? The Jacobite, Jakbeam, means the Jacobite who causes Ra to shine, okay? Joseph is the son of Jacob, and he's married into the priesthood of Ra. You also have at the same time over in Canaan the seal from a guy named Yakbeam, or his name is Menesu Ra, which means the blessed of Ra, Yakbeam Har, which means Jacob of the mountain, okay? Remember how they're ruling over Canaan too? Well, Jacob is going to rule over Hebron. The Judahites are going to be there in Hebron. And it's during that period that they're going to get the story of Job from Ram, because Ram's uncle is Elihu, who is the Elihu in Job. And they're going to, all of a sudden, this god Seth is going to become a storm god in the Book of the Dead. He's not a storm god before this, but he's going to become a storm god in the Book of Dead and become this evil god. And it's all about like trying to imprison this evil god. Well, that's because that's who they consider to be the god of the Hyksos. So, of course, when they see their realms being taken over by the Hyksos, their god is ruling over, and they consider their god to be Seth, because they probably call him the god of Seth before they call him Yahweh. But anyways, you have Yakbeam, Semesurah. Notice you have this period, 1805 to 1705. Remember how the line of the Jews before the captivity of the Jews is 100 years. You have Yakbeam Sennacherib, which is Joseph, down to Sheshimabre. Notice they all have Ra in their name. Remember, Joseph is married into the priesthood of Ra for 1805 to 1705. It's a 100-year period. Well, this is not. This is the same dynasty. This is the same Hyksos dynasty. It's just accounted by a different dynasty of people with a different language after the Tower of Babel, and then they're going to just go juke it around and move it, okay? So remember how I told you that Manetho is going to count Phoenician shepherd kings before the Hyksos? Well, all he's doing is he's taking two different records of the Hyksos and he's just stacking on top of each other. So best attested king of the dynasty, he left his name on two monuments at Avaris. His name means the Nubian. And then this goes down to Apophis, that's who they name the one that they overthrow. So see how you have multiple different versions of this? But when you get the one with the timeline on it, what do you have? You have 100 years. Well, that's how long you have before the Jews go into captivity. It's between 100 and 150 years. Notice you have or after 650 BC. This dynasty is going to get over. They're going to go in there somewhere around 1700, maybe a little after, as late as like 1770, and then they're going to rule, or they're going to be turned into captives around 1550, and then it's going to be around 26 after that they kill all the babies, and that's when Moses is born, and then 80 years later Moses is going to lead them out. Okay. So even though this chronology is off, you got to remember that's because they're stacking it back. Notice this is the 14th dynasty. This is not the Hyksos. It says a series of rulers reigning during a second intermediate period over the Nile Delta region. And then the 15th dynasty is the Hyksos. Why? They don't know their history. They had the Tower of Babel happen. And then they start writing history after they captivate the Jews. That's what happens. And they don't start composing consolidated kings lists until after the Jews leave, and they're humiliated. And so they've got a lot of redaction to do. Okay? So we know this from Egypt's history. They redact, change, redact. So how come when you get on Wikipedia, people are like, oh, it's this dynasty, then this dynasty, then this dynasty, then this dynasty? Well, because the famine stela from 200 BC says the same guy who solved the 7-year famine is the same guy who built the Giza pyramid. Well, that works really well with the idea that the Jews built the pyramids. No, it doesn't, because Joseph didn't build the pyramid. You literally have stuff that is probably pre-flood that was rebuilt upon to create the pyramids, or the pyramids themselves were just rebuilt. Could be that. Could be either one. But then we're going to come up to this dynasty. Bear with me. We have this 12th dynasty of Egypt, which doesn't say it ends with a famine, but it does end with a female ruler with no heir. Okay? And she's accounted to 1802, which is the generation right before the other Phoenician shepherd kings before the Hyksos. None of this makes sense. And she is, during this period, you're going to have this story of Sinhue pops up. Sinhue is literally the story of Joseph, except he's an Egyptian. It's the story of this guy who was like the right hand to the king, and then the king gets murdered or overthrown, and he's just heartbroken, and so he goes wandering into Syria, and he finds this prince of Syria, and they call it the land of Yah. Okay? Not making this stuff up. It's Yah. It's Y-A-A. The land of Yah. So it sounds like Yahweh. Okay? This land of Yahweh, this Sinhue, whose name seems to mean something having to do with the tree of life, also referred to as Senahat and Sanhath. Remember, Joseph's name is Zaphnath Paneah. Okay? Paneah has to do with bread. Sanahath is his name, and Joseph's name is Zaphnath. Okay? Remember, there was a Babel incident, and so you have a bunch of people with different names, and Zaphnath Paneah is Zanhath, okay? Or Zanahat. Zaphnath, okay? So now, this guy is an Egyptian, and it says this is a story, this is one of those epic stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh or stuff like that, where you keep having revisions to it, but the basic story stays the same, okay? And he goes into this land, and he's going to die of heartbreak because of his king. Remember how Jacob's going to die of heartbreak because of the loss of his son. Well, he's going to die of heartbreak because of his king. And he goes to Syria, which is that's the land that they would call Phoenicia, and that whole land is Syria, which is where they come from, and is also where they're going to get their wives. And over there, he meets the prince of the Syrian of the province of Yah, and the guy gives him his daughter and the best of the lands, just like they marry into the priesthood of Ron and get the best of the lands of Egypt. Okay, and then basically he has all his adventures, and the whole thing is about how he wants to die and be buried in Egypt, which is what Joseph says about dying and being buried back in the promised land. Okay, so people who are reading this stuff are like, gee, this sounds a lot like the story of Joseph. What is the guy's name? Sanhath. What is Joseph's name when Pharaoh changes it? Not Sanhath, but Zaphnath. Zaphnath Paneah. Okay, so Zaphnath, not Sanhath, but Zaphnath is, you take the PH out, it is Zanath. It's the exact same name. Sanath is Zaphnath, okay? You take one letter out, and there's Zanath. That's who he is, okay? And Zaphnath means something like, what does Zaphnath mean? Hold on. Revealer of secrets. Paneah, they think it means the unlocker of secrets. Zaphnath means hidden. Zaphnath. So you have Zaphnath and Sanhat, also pronounced Sinwe. Remember, they had the Tower of Babel incident, so they have 7 different languages in Egypt. Okay, this is why you're going to find all these gods and all these legends with a bunch of different pronunciations on them. First of all, they're interpreting hieroglyphs, but depending on who you're asking, what does that mean? They're going to say something different. 7 different versions of that. Okay, this is Joseph. It's the story of Joseph. They just have him inversed as an Egyptian instead of Assyrian, which is who they would have been counted as Assyrians or Phoenicians. Okay, remember, it's not called Phoenicia until the Greeks. The Greeks are going to call it Punes, based on the purple dye that comes from there. Okay, if you get these names down to the originals, what are they going to call that region? Well, they're not going to call it Syria until the Assyrians. So what are they calling it? When we read this stuff on Wikipedia, they're modernizing the names. Well, what they're going to call it is probably Aram Naharim or Mentani Naharim, because that's what they called Syria, and that's where the Jews would go and get their wives from, because that's where Abraham's brother Nahor was, who married in with the Arameans, hence Aram Naharim. Okay? So, what's the moral story? The moral story is you can't trust the Sumerians' kings list. So why did the authors of the Septuagint clearly make their version of the Bible based on it? Let me show you some really obvious problems with the LXX, okay? According to the Jews, Peleg is when the Tower of Babel happened. Now, Peleg would have been named after the earth itself being divided, not the nations being divided, okay? But Peleg is only the 4th generation. Shem, Arphaxad, Salah, Heber, 5th generation. But he's 4th generation from after the flood, okay? So you literally have 6 childbearing people having 4 generations of people. How many people could they have? Well, here's a hint. They're not having kids until they're 100, according to this. 130. Okay? So Peleg would have been born. People are like, oh, that gives you more time for the Tower of Babel. This is how dumb this is, okay? They stretch it out by adding 100 years, saying that gives you more time to multiply the people that you need for the Tower of Babel and all these other, archaeological effects and stuff like that to make sense. Except it doesn't, because they're not having kids until they're 130 now. See, if you multiply the time, but they're having kids when they're 30, well, then it gives you a lot more people. But if you multiply their times, but they're not having kids until they're 130, well, that shrinks the number of people. Especially when you're still adding, let's look at this. In the real Bible, when we go to Genesis 11, we see he has them at 35 years, he has them at 30 years, he has them at 33 years. For all we know, these kids could have had girls before they had boys. We don't know. But this is when they're having their sons, okay? 30, 35 years. And we know from the earlier generations that are counted in the Table of Nation that our Faxad and Sala and Heber were all in the Table of Nations, and so were Peleg and Joktan, all these guys. And we know that was all of their sons. Even the sons of Joktan, which are Peleg's brother, that's all of their sons. So by the time you get to Peleg, you're on 5 generations, and his brother has 13 kids that all become different nations. So you trying to tell me that his brother's 13 kids all become different nations when he's born before his brother? Well, so it can't be based on the name from when he's born. Well, what about the name when he dies? How many people could they be? And I did estimates using ChatGPT on how many people there could be based on the LXX. By the time Peleg dies, is 876 total people. Remember, they're not having kids until they're 130. So even if you're just like, oh, then he had kids, then he had kids, and then he had 13 kids, it doesn't matter. Those 13 kids are not having kids until they're 130. Now, this is how dumb this gets. They have them waiting till they're 130 to have kids, even when they're down to, look at this. Sala lives to be 130 years, and after he begot Heber, he lives 330 years. Okay. Well, that's 460 years. That's a good long time. Okay. Here's the problem. If I can start having kids when I'm a teenager, and I live to be 80, that's about 1/5 of my life when I start having kids. If Adam, here's the thing, they go back to Adam, right? Adam didn't have Seth until he was like 130, right? Here's the problem. Seth wasn't his first kid. They had Cain and Abel, and at least the daughters that Cain and Abel would have married before they had Seth. Which means, when did they start having kids? Probably 50. Not 130, not 230. It doesn't make sense. So now you have, look at this. This is Ragu, lived after he begot Serach 207 years. They got these guys living to be just 300, but they're still not having kids until they're 132 years, when they're just living to be 300. Now you have Nahor living to be 179 years before he has kids, and he lives to be 225 years. That's the equivalent of me not starting to have kids until I'm 60. Serach lived after he begot Nahor 200 years. So he's lived 109 years, and then he got his son, and then he dies afterwards, okay? That's the equivalent of like me and my lifespan today, not having kids until I'm 30 or 40. How big is the population going to be? These are maximums, 876. You can't get the math to work no matter how you do it. So they thought they were making stuff line up with these old chronologies when they started extending the years, but they forgot they also added that many years before they started having kids. And so they shrunk the number of people there, and it doesn't add up. But when you have people start having kids when they're 30, guess what? You're still going to have the same thing. Look at this. Population doubling this is LXX. They have the population doubling every 100 years. You know why that doesn't work? Because they're not having kids till they're 130. So how can the population double every 100 years? So I had to correct them to go, you're using normal population doubling metrics when you're saying they're not having kids until they're 130. They're like, oh yeah, you're right. And that's how they got these low numbers. See, first they're like, oh, 1.5 million. And then they're like, oh, yeah, you can't have the population double every 50 years if they're not having kids till they're 130. That doesn't make sense. Based on the Masoretic, in 100 years, those 12, the 12 sons, or whatever, I don't know how they got 12 people. Oh, that's how many people there were at Peleg's birth in the Table of Nations, turned to 48. 48 by the time Peleg is dead. That's what they figured out. No, I'm sorry. That's not going to work. Because he's going to live to be 400 years, so it's got to be much more than that. But I did this on another one. And what do you end up with, based on the Tower of Babel dates I have, under Hammurabi, is the whole world population being about 10 million, with up to half of that being in the region of Babylonia, and as much as 5% of that living right in the city of Babylon, which is like 50,000, something like that. So it's like 50,000. It's up to 50,000 living right in Babylon. It's like 5 million living in Babylonia, and then that's like half of the world's population. That actually makes very good sense if you just use the Masoretic text, and then that matches with the known archaeological data, because they say the whole world is 10 to 15 million people at that time based on all the known archaeological data we have. Okay? So, again, your guys who are fans of the LXX, I had a guy come back at me like, well, how do you explain the divinely inspired blah, blah, blah? Don't give me a religious answer just because your facts don't work. Okay? I don't need to believe that divine inspiration means that every word that these guys mentioned or spoke or copied down or scribed, there's Min with his erection again. That's who they're claiming as the first king of Egypt before the flood. Nope. This is Montu. This is the war god who seems to be a Nephilim. That's why he's got a bird head. Moral of the story is there's almost nothing believable in this. What I would expect this is what you get in the Palermo stone, which is probably pre-flood, are 5 different lines of people descended from Sethites, sons of Adam. And the heads of those lines are basically either in Egypt or in Sumer, and then they're going to spread through other places in the world, but those are the main 2 population centers. So you've got 5 different lines of people that are going to rule between Adam and the flood. That's what the Palermo stone represents. And then what you have from the Turin's King's List, the Abydos King's List, and the Karnak's King's List, or the Saqqara tablet, are all written in the days of Ramses. And these things, what they represent is the different lines of people. Remember, 7 different lines, because they call it this intermediate period. Well, what you have is Egypt being unified while Ham's alive. When Ham dies, it breaks up along these 7 nations, and then it gets reunified under Joseph. That's all you have. Because literally, if Ham dies roughly around the same time as Shem doesn't die till like, if the flood is 2300, Shem is going to live 500 years beyond that. So he's going to die around 1800. The Jews just go into Egypt around 1600. It's 200. No. I'm sorry, about around 1700. So 100 years after the death of Shem, which is 100 years after the death of Ham. So if they're just going 100 years after the death of Ham, you're going to see all these names with Amen in them. So again, you see all these old names, which are junk names, and all these Ra names. Amenemhat. See, this is the name on the list. This is what they were known as down through history. You see Mentuhotep, Senuseret, and Amenemhat in the generations after Ham and Sin die and they're deified. And you see that probably lasting for about 100 years before you get to Joseph. That's all the time it is. This is why the Bible warns you about endless genealogies. The world is not as old as you think. And the idea of just throwing more years at the world to make things easier to your scientific brain is very, very old. Know what else we know about the Egyptians? They practice birth control. So when we do the math on this and we go, the Bible says the Jews were like 200 million in this time. You know why people say that's impossible? Because they say the Egyptians were only like 200 million at that time. Or 2 million at that time, okay? Well, let's see what the Egyptians say about the Jews according to Exodus. It says, behold, the people of Israel are more and mightier than we. So why is it a sticker shock if they both have 2 million people, if they're saying right here the people of Israel are more and mightier than we? Because they weren't. Here's why they're such different. The Jews are going to go into Egypt with probably a few thousand people with all their servants and their families. Okay? It's probably like a few thousand people total. But the Egyptians practice birth control and the Jews do not. So 250 years later, guess who's winning? It's the same thing with all the Western, all your white people with your great white fear of losing or diminishing your numbers. Stop practicing birth control. That's why your numbers are diminishing. You're practicing birth control and all the brown people aren't. That's why. Why do you think there's so many people in India and in China up until they started practicing forced birth control, and then all of a sudden they're in a demographic decline? The Egyptians, or the Egyptians, we have 3 different records going back to 1800. 1800 is around the time where you start getting things like the Atrahasis popping up saying that the world was flooded because it was overpopulated. And the Egyptian priests are coming up with different ways to have birth control, including like putting crocodile dung in a woman's vagina and different weird stuff to catch the sperm and clean out the sperm and poison the uterus against being impregnated. This kind of stuff is being practiced in Egypt from the 1800s BC. So at least a century before Joseph gets there, they're practicing birth control. And the Jews are having as many kids as they can. So it shouldn't be a shock that they have more people at the end, because it just matches all the archaeological data. It matches everything we know. These people who came out of Egypt were as big, they were half of Egypt. That's how big they are. They're half of Egypt. Comes out of Egypt. That's why they're able to overthrow the Kassites and defeat the Hittites and all this other stuff. I mean, yeah, God's on their side. But they're also now a great and mighty nation. This is what the Bible calls them. This is what the Egyptians call them. They call them a people more and mightier than we. They went into Egypt as a small nation. They came out a mighty nation. Why? They kept having kids while the other people were practicing birth control. And they kept marrying. They weren't marrying, for the most part, the Egyptians. The Danites probably were, because the Danites are founding cities with the Egyptians in Greece. So the Danites were probably heavily married in with the Egyptians, while the rest of the Israelites were, at least we know the Judites and Manassites, they're marrying Arameans, sometimes Canaanites, but the more faithful ones are going up to their Aram Naharim, and they're marrying in with the descendants of Nahor. So they're growing their people from an outside source, adding to their numbers, plus their in-laws. Okay, which are probably sometimes coming too, while the Egyptians are practicing birth control. And then, let's look what it says. It said, "Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, when they fall out in war, they join our enemies and fight against us, so as to put them out of land. Therefore they did set them over their taskmasters to afflict them with burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses." And Ramses is Avaris, okay? "But the more they afflicted them, they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. And all their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives," and that's when they try to kill their kids. Now what they're realizing is they're still multiplying them the more they afflicted them. Well, the reason they're multiplying, we know this now, and this is in Manetho's history too. He says that they drove the Hebrews out of, because basically the Hebrews were at Heliopolis. That's the city of On, which is where Joseph was married into the priesthood. Well, Heliopolis is up here. Memphis, which was the former capital, remember that the dynasty the 14th dynasty, who's counting all these Hyksos rulers, which is the Jacobim, who shines like Ra or something like that, or causes Ra to shine. Well, there's Heliopolis. It used to be called On. That's the Egyptian name. This is the Greek name for it. And this is where Joseph's married in with a family. Avaris is where the Jews are settling. This is Goshen. They have canals going all the way out to the sea. And from there, they are going to Byblos and Carchemish. They're bringing in chariots and sickle swords. They're colonizing Crete and Greece and Cyprus with the Egyptians. So they've got Egyptians leaving the country too with them. And then those Egyptians, the Coptic Egyptians, are the ones who get overthrown. Now, you guys might have heard me say that the people of Abydos went to India in a past video. That was a mistake, okay? So if you heard that, disregard that. I was reading a book on comparative mythology, and I mistook a chart to be saying that. The chart was actually comparing, I think it was like the genetic makeup of 4 different versions of what I would call Hamites in India and Egypt, whatever, Kush and somewhere else. And Abydos was the population sample that they had for Egypt. It wasn't in India. It was just India was right across from it. So I thought they were saying all those 4 were found in India. I made a mistake. So anyways, the Abydos, I believe, is, so you have Memphis up here. This is all Lower Egypt. You go up here, you're going to have Thebes. This lake right here, they believe was, the Patterns of Evidence guys believe was built by Joseph to make more water for more food and stuff like that, and to control the flood of the Nile. So they actually have like an overflow. So the Nile flood can only flood so much before it overflows into this lake. And that would preserve overflooding so that they would have a more consistent crop yield. Joseph does that. And there he is at Heliopolis, and there's where this is. And then up here, you're going to have Thebes. Okay? So Thebes, first let's go to Kift. Oops. You see where, this is Lower Egypt, where we were just looking at. This is Kift right here, which is where the Copts come from. So you see F's and P's mixed up, because in Hebrew, the F is a PH, and it's just a P with another symbol next to it. Q is Copt, but some people are going to turn the Q into a G, K, G, and then some people are going to pronounce a G, a J. And so Egypt, this is where Egypt comes from, and then the Greeks call it Egypt, based on the Copts, okay? Their city is called Keft, or Coptos, or Kift, or Kebto, or Coptos, see? So all these are different names for Kift. Remember, there's 7 languages, okay? That's how you figure this stuff out. Now you go to Thebes. Thebes is their capital city. It's right there by Kafd. It's literally like within 50 miles of Kafd. So what are they doing? This is the people who the Jews seem to co-rule with, and they're taking over. No, I'm sorry. I might be mistaken. No, I think it is the Copts, actually. I do think it is the Copts. I guess I'll have to double check that before I put that in my book, because the Copts could be the ones that overthrow them. It is the Thebans who seem to overthrow them. But they could just take over Thebes. You have the people of Memphis, and then the people of Thebes. Those are the main 2 cities. And then Thebes, I believe, is going to be where they call it the city of Amun. That's Ham. Okay, so I'm gonna have to get this right. It's the people of Memphis that are ruling with the Jews, not the people of Thebes. The people of Thebes are going to flee to Thebes when the Jews take over with the kings of Memphis. So I'm going to have to fix that in my book. And then you're going to have the reason Crete and those are named Keft or Copt is because after these guys overthrow the Jews, they're going to take over their cities in Greece. That's what's going to go on. And then the Jews are going to take them back after the captivity. So this is why I do these videos. This is verbal processing for what's ultimately going to go into my book. I'm showing you what I'm researching, and I'm showing you how this stuff goes down. So it's Amhos II is the one who is, it says his brother Amhos II continued to capture Avaris. Amhos drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and the Levant and reclaimed the lands formerly ruled by them. So that's what is said, okay? That's not true. They drive them back to Avaris, and what happens is during that time you have, this is why we talk about Ram and these guys in Hebron, and then Makir up in the Golan. And those guys get pushed out by the Nephilim who come back with the Amorites, because what happens here is the Hittites are going to sack Babylon in 1595. That is 40 years before the Jews get pushed back into Avaris, okay? So the Amorites are on the decline in Babylonia from the Tower of Babel onwards. And the Tower of Babel would have been about 105 years before this. And so this southern region gets taken over by the Sealand dynasty. Then the Babylonians are going to get sacked here by the Hittites. Now, the Hittites and the Amorites seem to have bad blood when they end up on different sides in Naram-Sin's fight against because Naram-Sin is going to decimate the Amorites, and he seems to plan to put a Hittite, this title king of the Goyim, seems to be a Hittite that he plans to have rule over Canaan. Well, they lose because of Abraham and his Amorite allies. After decimating the Amorites and the Nephilim tribes and the Horim, which are the people who Esau's moved in with or married in with, and because the Hittites were basically traitors to the other Canaanites, they got a skedaddle and they go up into Anatolia and they start their kingdom up there. Okay, well, eventually by 1595 they're going to sack Babylon, and that is going to make them a major power. Okay, so before this, 1595, remember this is 40 years before the Israelites are overthrown in Egypt. The Israelites, Egyptians, and the Mitanni, so the Memphis Egyptians, the Mitanni Naharim, which are up in the Aramaeans, and the Israelites who are also in Canaan, in Judea and the Golan, they're all getting along. They're all trading with each other. They've got trade going all the way to the corn mines, the tin mines of Cornwall in England, to Crete, to the copper mines of Cyprus. They're pulling in bronze. They're pulling in horse-drawn chariots. They're pulling in sickle swords. They've got all kinds of money, and they're keeping the Amorites at bay over here and the Hittites at bay over there. Well, when they start to overthrow the Jews after the death of Joseph, because Joseph would have actually died within about, I think he lives to be 110, so he would have died probably within 5-10 years of this. This seems to be when the Thebans start to overthrow the Jews, or overthrow the Egyptian kings who are allied with the Jews, and then the Jews themselves. And what Manetho says is that they drive them back to Avaris. It doesn't say they drive them out of Avaris. They drive them back to Avaris. They kick them out of Heliopolis and that's where Joseph's heirs would have been. And then these other Jews come and reinforce them from the Jerusalem region. Well, that's going to be the Judahites from Hebron coming back. And it's also going to be the Manassites of Makir coming back because they're intermarried. And so you have these two groups that are living in Canaan coming back, and probably the Danites coming back, because the Danites are going to be out in the Egyptian cities with them. But when the Copts of Thebes take it over, they take over those cities. So the Danites come back, the Manassites come back, and the Judahites come back. And what are those? Those are the three biggest armies of the Israelites when they leave in the Exodus. They all come back about a century before they leave in the Exodus. Okay, so the three biggest armies, trace that back to a year. Those guys are probably representing numbers of, I would say, upstairs of 200,000 men, military men. Okay, coming back. And so at that point, the Egyptians are like, oh crap, they're still multiplying even though they did this. Well, yes, of course they're multiplying, because you guys didn't know this in your 7 languages and your Babel effect. But these people weren't just these people who were in Avaris who had just taken over Egypt. They had relatives all over the place. They had relatives in Greece. They had relatives in Syria. And they had relatives in Canaan. And what happened at the same time that the Egyptians are enslaving them is that the Amorites are kicked out of here. And so what do? They take their Nephilim and they go back to Canaan and kick the Jews, the Manassites, and the sons of Makir, basically the Gileadites, and the Judahites out of Canaan. And then as they are kicking the Danites out of their tribal lands too, well, they're going to sail back to Avaris, and they're going to become the big armies of the Danites and these guys who are still there. And they're married with the Egyptians of Memphis, these Danites are. So they're going to have marriage relationships with the Egyptians of Memphis, but they're basically fortified into Avaris. And what they're doing then is they have their tribute of brickwork and all this stuff, but they're not going to war against them because they weren't really prepared for war. That's why they get driven out wherever they are. They have trade and stuff going on. They're not really military powers, okay? They're somewhat, They have some, fighters among them, but they're not a massive army yet. They're not really prepared to be an army yet. They're just a big people group. And so when they double up their numbers, basically, in Avaris, that's when the Egyptians try to say, hey, let's have the midwives try to kill their babies, and that leads to the drowning of the kids in the Nile. That's going to happen somewhere around, remember it said, we saw it was 1595 when they sack Egypt. Well, it's 1446, so that's 140 years later that Moses takes them out, so which means that's going to be within 60 years of that Moses is born. So within 40 years of the Amorites having to leave Babylon, they're going to migrate. Remember, there's Amorites in Mari and places like this too. These Amorites are getting kicked out of all of these lands by the Kassites, the Sea Peoples, and the Semites who live there, and they're consolidating their numbers back in the Amorite territories. They're going to take some land from the Ammonites, and then they're going to take some land from the Maccurate Manassans, so basically sons of Joseph, and then they're going to resettle back in Canaan, kick those people out, and those people are going to go into Egypt. And that, my friends, is what happens. So all of this stuff, you don't need these dynasties after dynasty. I mean, look at this. These are supposedly gods. Horus ruled for 25 years. Maybe, or maybe 100 years. Who knows? Isn't he a god? Isn't Ares a god? Isn't Anubis a god? Isn't Heracles? Notice Heracles is based on Samson. See, you see how they're ripping stuff off from the Greek gods here? A lot of these gods weren't even invented yet. Okay, Horus would have been around. Ares could have potentially been based on Montu or something like that. Anubis may have been around. Heracles definitely wasn't. Apollo wasn't. Ammon was based on Ham. Sosos or Tithos, I think one of these is... this is funny. They have Ammon right here. That's Ammon. And then Zeus, is that Ammon? No, it's BS. This is Baal. This is based on Baal. So how are your scholars and your 3rd century Jews trying to align with this nonsense? Because they're worldly. Because they want the approval of the world. And so your scholars, I'm going to keep mocking these academic scholars in case you guys aren't picking up when I say scholars. It's not because I'm anti-academia. It's because I'm anti being a biatch and like telling people what they want to hear. Oh, the LXX lines are better with your archaeology. But your archaeology is based on this nonsense. It's based on nonsense. And when you get into the archaeology, and I keep teasing out the data and trying to figure out what's the proof is Manetho. So wait a minute. These kings lists that are much older than Manetho, that don't nearly line up with Manetho or each other, that are finally consolidated into Manetho 1,000 years later, is how we determine how old this stuff is? Yup. And they'll claim other stuff like carbon dating and astrological cycles and blah, blah, blah. It's BS. You might every now, once in a blue moon, be able to line up something because we've modeled out the stars in the heavens and we figured out there was an eclipse back in XXX BC. And they say, oh, that lines up with this, or it seems to. And somebody pops up a paper that has a theory on that. They didn't do that with all these guys. Most of the stuff, they're just taking this at face value. And if you just read these Wikipedia articles and you read the scholarly articles that they point to, what you're going to find is this is contested, this is contested, this is contested, this is contested, it's all contested, scholars disagree, some people think this is just an outright forgery. That's in the scholarly community. So when you see Christians saying the LXX is better because it matches with the archaeological data, they don't know the archaeological data. Christian teachers and scholars are notoriously bad historians. They always have been. They're bad at matching stuff up with archaeology. They're bad at matching stuff up with history. What they do is they capitulate to the world wherever they can, and then they just tuck their tail between their legs and say, I don't know, maybe the Bible is just a bunch of metaphors. They've always done this. This is why you don't go with these people's lines. And you can trace this kind of bullcrap all the way back to Clement and Augustine and Origen. Okay? They were always capitulating to what the world says because there's a bunch of people that are all just cult priests who are literally telling people that your God can become part of that idol. And they're like, oh, that's interesting because our God becomes part of this bread. So they buy their crap. And they don't realize, no. The Egyptians don't believe the same thing as you do. They taught you to believe what you do. And that's why you've got synods. That's why you've got a bunch of priests that balance power with their pharaoh, which the emperor of Rome essentially is. That's why you got the Vestal Virgin cult, which is in your nuns. That's why you've got all their different things that they do, is because they're teaching it to you guys. And you guys keep saying, hey, if we make our stuff a little bit more like theirs, we'll get otherworldly people to join the church, just like they do now with fog machines and dancing girls. Because that's literally what's going on in our churches now. Okay? They've always been doing this. You have to fight for the Bible being true. You have to push and fight and demand, scrutinize their data. Show me, prove it. Show me, prove it. Prove it. And what you're going to find out is they don't know. It's consensus. It's scholarly consensus. What does that mean? It means we don't know how we know, but a lot of us think it. That's all they're doing. And remember, back when the Egyptians did that, they knew that they were more and manier than them. They were more and mightier. Well, we're more and mightier than them. The church has more intelligence in it than all of the scholars of all the academic institutions put together. These guys are on magic right now. They're trying to tell you this. These actual people are trying to tell you that, oh, our quantum computers are so fast because they're using computers in the multiverse. That's freaking sci-fi. And they're pretending it's real. They're saying we've come up with quantum computing. They're saying trust the AI. The AI is better. It's faster, it's better, it's faster. And people are trying out ChatGPT 5 and they're like, no, it's not better and faster. The only thing it does is spits out a lie quicker. Because I use this thing and I'm telling you, I use it on the regular and I constantly have to call BS on it. Constantly. It's like a dumb research assistant. It's like somebody who comes back to you. It's like some guy and you give him a task to do and he comes back to you with an answer really fast and he thinks you're impressed because of how fast he came back with the answer and he's wrong like 90% of the time. Like, nope, factor in this. Nope, look up that. Nope, prove your source out. And you know what happens every time I challenge GPT and say that's BS? Eventually, after it wastes 5 minutes of my time, it says, oh, you're right, I'm sorry, I hallucinated. What's your next question? This is how this stuff works. And they're going to deceive the whole world into believing this is a God. They already have people deceived into believing this is a God. And this right here is just the Egyptian transmutation X'd up to the present day with technology and dark sentences made of computer code. It's just the same old magic and alchemy. It's just made of electrical computer code now. But guess what? At the end of the day, your ones and zeros, if they don't know how to logic, they don't know how to math. And they're going to make up stuff. Just like the Egyptian priests made up stuff. But when you know how to logic and you know how to math, you can call BS on the stuff they're making up. How are these guys having 60-year reigns when they're supposedly living to be hundreds of years old? That don't science, brah. That don't science. Same thing with the LXX. How the heck are there enough people to build the tower? Because all of this stuff, this house of cards is all built on top of each other. The LXX is the true version, and Peleg is when the Tower of Babel happens. That's the only way we can line up with all the archaeology of the world. And you tell me, do the math. How many people there are at the beginning of Peleg's life and at the end of Peleg's life? Because according to this, it says in his days the world was divided. The earth was divided. So if that's when the Tower of Babel happened, what is the maximum amount of people that could have existed? And you explain to me how God takes 700 people and divides it into 70 nations. Better yet, explain how 700 people built a tower that was so big it was up to the heavens. Because I'm pretty sure China couldn't do that with less than 7,000 people. With all their technology. So you tell me how these guys built a great tower that was so big and so huge, like they're always saying, and somehow this guy tried to take over the world as a tyrant when there's only 700 people. It doesn't make any sense. You have to use the Masoretic. The LXX is garbage, okay? I don't care. But the apostles quoted it. I don't care. I don't care. I don't have some rule that says an apostle can never make a mistake. I know Matthew, Mark, and Luke differ on exact stories that are exactly the same, and they don't say the exact same thing, which means they can't all be true. I'm not saying they're lies. I'm just saying there's 3 different versions of what Jesus said, and they don't all say the exact same thing. So either he said the same thing 3 different ways, 3 different times, and they're all true, or they're not perfect in their recollection, even if they are inspired by the Spirit to recall what they recalled, or to write down the scribal record that they wrote down. Okay? I believe they're inspired. I don't believe they're perfect. I believe they have errors in them. And as soon as you get over this religious, it has to be word for word perfect, you're going to stop coming up with dumb ideas based on stuff that contradicts the scripture. Canaan is in Luke 3. Canaan is not in Chronicles. Well, what was there first? Here's an obvious thing. If an older record doesn't have a guy in it, you need to come up with a reason why they took that guy out. Because it's easy to understand why they added a guy. They added a guy. Why? Probably because they're trying to align with the Egyptian records of Canaan. Canaan is a famous early guy to them. Canaan is who they claim to be. The worship of Canaan was started by Menes, and he was the author of all their Egyptian mysteries. And they wrote all their stuff from the flood down from before the stone, and the stones has Canaan on it. Well, guess what the Jews have in the book of Jubilees? And in Josephus, about some people who had a stone that was written down before the flood with all the stuff about it on how to plant and how to sow, and the astrological records and all that stuff, and that's what we have at the Palermo stone. Is that a coincidence? Probably not. The Egyptians are saying they wrote down their stuff on stone before the flood, and that's how they're so smart. The Jews are saying they wrote down their stuff on stone, and that's how they're so smart, and they lived in Egypt. And that stuff has a guy on it named Canaan. Canaan is my protector, is who Khufu is, and the guy who built the pyramids. And so they say Canaan must be Canaan. Well, where does he fit? Well, he can't be the same Canaan as our Canaan. We'll make him the son of Arphaxad. And they added him in. And you're like, no, Jews wouldn't make stuff up. Jews are righteous and noble, and they take their copying of their scribal stuff down very, very seriously. And I'm going, do they, though? Have you read the Bible where they forgot the Bible for like 150 years? They forgot it existed? Do you pay attention to these guys? Do you read the parts where it says they're down in Egypt worshiping the gods of the Egyptians? Because I'm reading that part, and I'm factoring that in when I go and decide who wrote what and when. And that's what you guys need to do. Read the famine stela. It talks about Joseph's famine in the 2nd century, but it puts it back before the flood with Djoser and Imhotep. This is what the Egyptians do. And where was this located? Right there in Egypt. That's where they found it, okay? Where's Elephantine Island again? Right there in Egypt. Let me hold up. Let me put these 2 pictures together again. Let's see that one more time. We see the big lake here, and then we see Elephantine Island. Where's that famine stele again? We see the big lake here, and there it is. Where did they find it? The top part of the stele depicts 3 Egyptian deities, Khnum, Satis, and Anuket. Wait a minute. Isn't Khnum the same Canaan who's on Elephantine Island? Yes, it is. Where did they find this? They found it on the Nile on the Sahel Island near Aswan Dam. So another island right up the street from the Elephantine Island where Khnum is worshipped? Yep, that's where they found it. I think a whole lot of mixing of Jewish and Egyptian stuff happened there. What do you think? Yep, because there was a Jewish garrison full of people from the Persians. That makes a lot of sense to me that the Jews and the Egyptians would mix up stuff. And that's why the Jews and the Egyptians are both saying that Pythagoras got his stuff from us. And that's why they're mixing in Pythagoreanism in the early church to come up with their Gnostic Catholic religion. Okay? There you go. That's it. So I'm going to, again, try to sort this out. Thank you for listening. Any thoughts or ideas? Love to hear them. My books, again, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but my hyperlinks on my description sections don't work. YouTube took them away until I give them a photo ID or a picture of myself, which I'm not going to do. They're trying to put me on facial recognition so they can track me all over the world and try to data rape me into doing some stuff I don't want to do. So I'm not going to do that. So you guys need to copy and paste those links if you want to. copy and paste them. That's what you need to do. Get on a browser, and then you can buy my books if you want to donate. It's on Patreon. If you want to help me out, find my email in the About section. I have Venmo. And I will keep doing this digging for you guys and keep fighting for the Bible until the end of time. So I hope you guys are blessed by this. And Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.